Right, so we're going to look at the way the topic is framed, FutureScope, sensing the future, innovating in the present. We're going to focus on futures thinking and foresight, and the way I frame it is that futures thinking is the conceptual, is the theoretical, and foresight is the practical application to be able to do futures thinking. And today we're going to cover a little bit of both. Obviously, we won't have the chance to do the application, but at least you'll be introduced to one or two tools. Before I proceed, let me ask you to have a look at this picture and tell me what comes to your mind. What is common? Every one of these has the word scope in it, correct? So essentially what we're seeing here is we're seeing a microscope, we're seeing a telescope, we're seeing an oscilloscope, etc. What do these instruments do? They make the imperceptible perceptible. They make things that are seemingly indiscernible to us discernible. And hence the metaphor of FutureScope. FutureScope is, in inverted commas, an instrument to make the future discernible to us in some form or another. All right, so the metaphor of FutureScope is to make the future discernible, and that's what this way of thinking is about. We work on this leadership model on different lenses of leadership, and today we're focusing on the idea of the anticipatory leader. We want to be able to anticipate the future and the perspectives and how to respond, and that's where the innovation comes in. If we are able to anticipate the possibilities, then we need to decide what our response is, and part of that response has to be an innovative one, and innovative in the form of solutions. Take a piece of paper and consider the world in 2035, and may I ask you to jot down 3 words that stand out for you. So imagine it's now 2035, and just jot down 3 words about 2035 that come to you. Okay, please can you go to menti.com and type in this code. You can do it with or without the spaces, doesn't matter. And jot down your 3 words. So it gives you the opportunity to submit your words. All right, once you've done that, what will the world look like? You will then have the opportunity to submit the next question and identify which areas you believe will be radically different in 2035, radically different from what they are now. So you're doing 2 things. You're submitting your 3 words about what the world will look like in 2035, and then you're going to identify what would be radically different. You can then type in this code after that. So you're going to submit those 2. Here we have a little word cloud. People are still typing. I should have closed it before I shared it with you. But it's, in essence, what you see here is the bigger the word means more people have submitted that. The software is not clever enough to tell differences in spelling, so it's not that smart yet. But in essence, you kind of get a sense of what people's perspectives of the future might be. So digital, artificial intelligence stands out, healthcare. If you do a quick scan, you'll see quite a bit about inequality, increasing, robots, breakdown of democracy. So we're starting to get a sense of how we're perceiving the future world to be collectively. Which areas will be radically different? So 19 said how education is conducted, the role and purpose of business. Wonderful. So already we're starting to see, we're stretching our thinking about wondering how the world might be. Can I ask, is there anybody, when we looked at long distance travel, had space travel in mind? Space travel, when you thought about long distance travel, would be radically different. If you think about how education is conducted, I think that's something universities need to take into account, and probably we don't have to wait for 2040. Probably in the next couple of years, we're going to have a very radically different kind of form of education. And certainly the role and purpose of business, the weak signals are already there. The way we've been doing business for the last 50 years is hugely problematic. And we have to fundamentally reconceive the place of business in the world, in society. And, you know, I mean, the world has already moved on in many ways, but there's still what we call Horizon 1 thinking, where we're still stuck in an old model and we need an emerging new model around that. Okay, so this is starting to give us a sense of the kinds of things that we probably do need to think about. I'm now going to ask you to do one more menti.com, and then we'll get into a bit of the conceptual material and then a couple of tools and see where we head. Okay, so it should be open for you now. Believe the following won't exist in 2050. 11% of you said universities won't exist. 5% said marriage won't. Fossil fuel driven vehicles of any kind. So that's quite interesting. Partly one might expect we'd think that way. So that's good. Any accountants in the room? This is not so cool. This group are saying that your shelf life is limited, so you have to rewire yourself. Bankers, 20%. All right, so this is starting to tell us the perspectives about how the world could radically be different, about what might and might not exist. I think the global supply chain, 6% in my view, is pretty low. I think it'll be radically different. I feel universities probably almost don't exist in there. Yeah, that's just my perspective. I'm interested to see that people are starting to see that banks won't exist. So already, I mean, we're seeing some of the signals with blockchain and other kinds of technologies, and there's things we haven't even thought about. The scary one is 3% of us don't believe that the world's going to be here, and our children and grandchildren won't be here. So I guess that's starting to hint around things like climate change, catastrophes, and so on. So we need to bear that in mind and what we do about it. I love that teleportation. That's an interesting one, and it's quite interesting because teleportation is actually talking about dematerializing and rematerializing. And I know it's all sci-fi or was sci-fi, but yeah, we mustn't discount these things completely. Leanne, I hope you're going to rewire yourself into a new job, and maybe you can be a futures accountant. All right, futures thinking. It's a theoretical, philosophical, and conceptual body of knowledge about understanding and working with uncertainty of the future. So it's not just about the future, it's about the uncertainty of the future. It's the uncertainty that prevents us from knowing the future. It's interdisciplinary in terms of the ways, the modes of thinking, the perspectives, and the tools. And it draws on multiple natural and social science perspectives. So in a sense, it's a kind of an interdisciplinary field of theorizing and practice, and a lot comes from practice, not all from theorizing. FutureScope, as we calling it, that's just the kind of name I've given the kind of work I do, is a methodology and a set of tools to do futures thinking, but it's drawing on the broad perspectives of foresight. So you know, nothing radical in what's here. I've just kind of compiled my perspective of how I put these things together. So if just to confirm again, to reiterate how we're positioning it, futures thinking is the conceptual, the theoretical, the philosophical. Foresight are the practical applications and the methods to do futures thinking. There are no facts about the future because we can't empirically observe or measure it. So how do we do this futures thinking kind of stuff? Well, the key, and this is not new, it's been known for probably 40, 50 years already, is narrative, stories. So the future can be, and some innovative ways of working with that. So the future, in a sense, can be experienced through imaginative storytelling, immersive learning. That means putting yourself in perspectives that brings out in an immersive kind of environment through learning labs, through experiences out in the field, and a whole host of others, and using collaborative approaches to group model building and whole systems thinking. Why? Why does systems thinking play a role? Because in understanding the future, we need to be understanding interrelationships between things, between people, between perspectives, between variables that are changing over time. So in a sense, we might frame it like this. The future is an entanglement of trends, okay, because we all know there are trends for as long as the trends last. Discontinuities when the trends break. Our intuition, imagination, and emotions, hypotheses, and hunches. It's all of these things combined that helps us be able to work through understanding and experiencing the future in some form or another. Foresight, on the other hand, is the set of practical methods and a palette. I like to call it a palette of tools. There's a whole host of them. If you Google it, you'll find literally dozens of tools. And I'll give you some examples as we proceed. So foresight is a set of practical methods and palette of tools to apply futures thinking in the messiness of our everyday practice of the real world endeavors. So in the same way that a spreadsheet system can help organize a budget and show patterns that otherwise wouldn't be discernible to us, foresight methods help us to understand and work with different kinds of data and qualitative judgments to think about the future so that we can identify patterns and potential options. So let me ask you to do this now. Can you please imagine the kitchen table of the future? I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and imagine a kitchen table. So kind of picture it in your mind's eye in its full vividness. So keep your eyes closed now. Picture it in its shape, its color, form, the aesthetic, the function, everything you can about this kitchen table of the future. And if you have a piece of paper with you and some colored pens, draw what it might look like, or describe it in a few words.
The table brings inanimate objects to life using smart light. A camera observes what happens on the table and relevant graphics are projected back onto the surface. This kitchen table is about more than just dining. It is your preparation surface, hob, workbench, and children's play area. Explore creative flavour combinations. Get suggestions on what to cook based on things you already have at home. Be inspired by any tempting recipe. Set the timer to decide how much time and effort you want to spend. Place ingredients on the cutting board for advice on how best to prepare them. Use the built-in scales to get the proportions right for doughs and batters. Browse recipes. And be inspired by friends and family. Record and play back cooking sessions. Have the table guide you through the recipe. Collect your ingredients. Place your pan on the table and set the temperature to sear. Set the temperature to boil and the timer will start. Add another pan and set it to frying temperature. Coffee warm. Induction charge mobile devices. Heat food directly in your pantry cooling containers. Augment play. A table for living. All your kitchen stories brought to life on a single surface.
Why futures thinking? Because the future is unpredictable. And one of the reasons the future is unpredictable is about uncertainty. And this acronym of VUCA, which we've all heard by now and it's become well known. So I'm going to go very quickly, but just to make the point that each of these aspects of VUCA have their own nuances. So they collectively, they impact the unpredictability, but each one of them have their own nuances and we need to get a sense of what they are. And you'll see that the foresight methods start working towards addressing aspects of these. So volatility has to do with change through time, variables that are fluctuating. But what's important about volatility is we're not just talking about necessarily one dimension, one variable. There could be many dimensions and variable and scale. It can happen at a local scale, it can happen at a global scale, or different kinds of perspectives of scale. Uncertainty is that the future is inherently, our understanding of the future is inherently incomplete because of uncertainty. And we have now what is known as the information paradox. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, if we were uncertain about something, we would need to gather more information, and gathering more information helped us deal with uncertainty. Now we have the information paradox. There is just so much of information. The more information that we get just doesn't help us clear the uncertainty. In fact, it might make us even more uncertain. Similarly, the idea of expertise frailty. In the past, it's not always the case, but quite often, when we're faced with a complex problem, if we brought in the experts can help us work through it. But when you're dealing with fundamental uncertainty, having more expertise is not going to help us because we have what's known as an incomparable future past. Expertise help us project the past and the current into the future based on our expertise. So we have this idea of an incomparable future past, and expertise in and of itself, expertise is important, but in and of itself is probably not enough. Complexity is the idea of entanglement between many variables and the cause-effect relationship. So they're fuzzy. We can't discern what's the cause, what's an effect, we can't even discern what the cause-effect relationships are in certain instances. Not always the case, And my perspective is that this complexity is what gives rise to the volatility, the uncertainty and the ambiguity. And ambiguity is interesting in that even though we have full information, and let's suppose we didn't have all this volatility and all of that, ultimately, when we are dealing with human actors, it's ambiguity. We each bring different interpretations to bear to the same information, same facts, if I call it. And that's a big part of ambiguity. And the more the world's becoming complex, the more our metaphors are incompatible. So I think of an economy with a particular metaphor. You will have a different metaphor for an economy. So when we're talking to each other, we're actually talking about different things, and that adds to the ambiguity. So that's just kind of a very quick kind of journey through VUCA in a little more detail. There's lots more, but I think this suffices for now. On the other hand, we want to be able to perceive the future. And to do that, well, one of the reasons we want to do that is we want to have not just the intellectual, but the emotional readiness for when that future hits us. And in order to get there, we need a structural understanding of change. And that goes back to what are these things driving the VUCA to help us to become agile, responsive, and ultimately create resilient systems. Firstly, us resilient as human beings and how we respond, but resilient systems around us. So we must have economies that are resilient. We must have ecosystems that are resilient. We need to have families that are resilient. This takes a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of minds from many, many people that have to come together. And to have that emotional readiness for the future, we also have to develop our skills, maybe not the right word, our ability, our capability to start becoming empathetic. Because the only way we can understand the future is to be able to be empathetic to what others might be perceiving. And then that obviously brings us to ethicality and ethicality of response. So we've got this gap. We've got this complex VUCA world that's full of messiness and uncertainty and cause of tension and anxiety. And on the other hand, we want to have a future that we want to understand, work with, be ready for, and how do we bridge that gap? And that's where future thinking and foresight comes in, and this idea of FutureScope. So here's a very broad methodology. Essentially, what you would need to be able to do is to be able to scan the environment, scan the signals in the environment, scan the variables that are changing, how they're changing, etc. Engage in a process of interpretation, understanding that information that we have. Futures thinking, foresight are participatory sports. They're not individual sports. The only way we make sense of the future is to engage in dialogue. We got to work in participatory ways with other people who bring perspectives to bear that we wouldn't bring, that help us work with the possibility of the future. Then we can envision plausible futures. This is an important word. It's plausible. It's not saying predictable. What you are doing is you envisioning, considering, through using this information, through working with dialogue, to applying techniques to envision multiple plausible futures that might occur, none of which are likely to occur in and of themselves, but collectively, by understanding the uncertainty, we have a readiness for those futures. Then we need some way of articulating them. And you'll see some of the methods. Scenario planning is the one that's most well known in the futures field, and that's articulating in the form of narratives and stories. But there's versions of that take it, enhance it, nuances, give it more subtlety. And ultimately, we then have to act based on this kind of process we go through to be able to do futures work. Essentially, this is shown as a network, meaning that you don't necessarily do all of this in sequence, although you probably will as a start, but you're constantly moving back and forth between your dialogue, between your interpretation, between your acting. So acting and learning are intertwined as well. So the future is always a story, and the important thing is there's always more than one story. If you haven't been exposed to futures thinking before, or some form, even if it's just scenario thinking, likelihood is that we unconsciously have what we call an official future. In each one of us in our minds, even though we know the future is uncertain, we have a perspective of what the future is likely to be. And part of futures thinking is to get out of that lockstep mode of thinking of one official future because we know it ain't going to happen, to think about multiple plausible futures, none of which in and of themselves will happen, but their combinations are likely to happen in some form or another to help us be ready for it. So the future is always a story, and there's always more than one story, which is a construction. That's an important part. The stories are constructed by the human actors that are working with the information around them. Okay, so here's a whole palette of foresight tools. Obviously, we can't go through all of them, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the whole set of palette of tools, and some of them are in of themselves little methodologies. Others are tools, application tools in and of themselves, which you combine. So this is not a linear map of methods, because they impact each other and they can be used in different kinds of sequencing, and you use some and you don't use others. And some of them are in and of themselves kind of, like, for example, scenario planning or participatory futures are little methodologies themselves, but you can still use them and combine them with others. And I will share maybe one or two of these before we close. I'm watching time. Hopefully that gives you a sense and a taste of one or two of these methods from the practical side of what we can do. Participatory futures games. Okay, so essentially this, I kind of gave you the sense that futures is about dialogue and working together. So in October, I'm going to be participating in a participatory futures games on space exploration. So there's World Futures Week coming up, and it's this game about participatory futures. And these are some of the questions in time trying to design these participatory futures. And how does this sound to you? With moon colonization on the horizon, should the moon be governed as a commons or even be as a legal person? What about equity in space? Is there space only for the 1%? Mars, commercialization of space. What are the issues, the risks, the boundaries? Militarization of space. We have enough of the conflict here, but what does that mean? How do we address, we're putting out all the satellites and all the stuff in space. What do we do with the space debris and space junk? And what are the impacts of that in the future? And who takes accountability for that? The right to a dark sky. Do we really want Coke ads twinkling down on us at night? Privatization of space rights, human rights to space. So you can start to see that as we move into the future, we hit with things we hadn't conceived about before. And our legal profession just, we're just not ready with legal instruments to deal with it. Our financial instruments are not necessarily ready to deal with it. So our existing systems will come under a fair bit of pressure to be able to respond. And that's part of futures thinking, is to help us. So whatever profession you're in, when you're engaging in futures thinking, it's a way of innovating about how our existing systems, one, either need to be redesigned or adapted, or actually thrown away completely and restarted, rebuilt, reconceived. All right, so here's an example of one foresight method called participatory futures games. And so this is an example. In October, I'll be participating in one of that. It's an international game. Right, so let's ask this question. Do you think we could have, as a world, we could have anticipated the coronavirus? Okay, almost everybody is saying yes. Did we? Had we? And how have we responded? Or could we have responded better? So here's a little video to share with you, Andrew.
It began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. Experts agree, unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere.
The mission of the Pandemic Emergency Board is to provide recommendations to deal with the major global challenges arising in response to an unfolding pandemic. The board is comprised of highly experienced leaders from business, public health, and civil society.
We could be looking at double the number of cases in 1 week and 16 times as many in a month if we are not able to stop the spread. That would be on the order of 500,000 cases, and it would continue to rise exponentially. In 3 months, we could be approaching 10 million cases.
We're at the start of what's looking like it will be a severe pandemic. And there are problems emerging that can only be solved by global business and governments working together.
We have known about CAPS-like viruses in animals and people for decades, but have not been successful at developing a licensed vaccine. And sure, there are new technologies that may help, but it's going to be difficult. I am not optimistic about having a vaccine in time to be relevant during this pandemic.
So the policy crisis in question for this board in this meeting is this: how should governments, business, and international organizations allocate and distribute pandemic antivirals and medical supplies to the people who need them most?
What we've seen work very well in the HIV field is, in fact, procurement through the Global Fund. So having a centralized mechanism, so financially able to procure on behalf of affected countries would be critical. I think the second thing is it's going to be very important that for the business sector, for manufacturers of antivirals, that we have clarity around what the need is and where the need is and who are making the decisions.
I think that given that the countries most affected are those that are low and middle income countries with unequal access to technology, to finances, the UN has a worldwide footprint, universally recognized, and universal membership.
A global stockpile would certainly help ensure more rational and strategic allocation, but the reality is that we don't have the logistics capability, even within the UN, to bring that together in one place and run it. So this is where I think a collaboration between the international organizations like the World Health Organization and the private sector, which runs these supply chains for many purposes every day, understand where the supplies are, make smart decisions about how to allocate them to the people who need them in the places that need them the most, and then work with the industry to move those supplies from where they are today to where they need to be.
Just to underscore the point that cooperation among supply chain providers or businesses that have huge supply chains can add a lot of efficiency to the whole process.
The question is, can you, through this international mechanism, really promote commitments to doing this as quickly as possible and give people a sense that actually if they contribute more, that they will have a better chance of protecting their own populations and their country's security and health.
So to be completely clear, most of this production would already be committed in contracts.
Yes.
It is almost unheard of that people are producing product without having a forward commitment for the consumption of that product. So the first thing that needs to be done, because this is not something that the countries currently control, unless countries are going to bring about emergency situations and co-opt an existing supply chain.
I think it's not likely, I agree, that countries are not going to buy countermeasure to put into a global supply without retaining a large portion of it for themselves.
Public health agencies have issued travel advisories, while some countries have banned travel from the worst affected areas. As a result, the travel sector is taking a huge hit. Travel bookings are down 45%, and many flights have been canceled. A ripple effect is racing through the service sector. Governments that rely on travel and tourism as a large part of their economies are being hit particularly hard.
How should national leaders, businesses, and international organizations balance the risk of worsening disease that would be caused by the continued movement of people around the world against the risks of profound economic consequence of travel and trade bans?
If there's some sense that there's a UN institution that can do all of this, then I worry we're suffering from a delusional disorder on the power of the UN. It's really important to get those industries and their trade associations and an efficient leadership established, which is decentralized, but has a collective responsibility and accountability. And that needs to be supported by the public leadership.
What is essential, what is non-essential travel, we have to clarify this. Otherwise, if we go down to 20% bookings over a long period, the company will run down. That's a fact.
You know, there's a whole complex set of issues in a highly interdependent world on supply chains that are just in time. We need to think about how much flex there is in that just-in-time supply chain system and make sure it keeps running. I think it's going to take specificity, and it's going to take knowledge that only the private sector has. The UN can play an important coordinating facilitation role, but the companies know where those commodities are, where they move, how to move them, and that's where a type of public-private collaboration that we have not generally had in these crises needs to be put together pretty quickly.
We are not out of money yet. But the fact is we are trending in a dangerous direction and something needs to change.
So the policy question for this board now is how should financial resources be prioritized? Are there nodes that we cannot allow to fail? What is your sense of priorities? We don't have money to pay for all of these urgent problems.
So at the moment, we want the funds, right? You need the money. So where's the money? So government kind of supplies some money. A lot of, private sectors, some are sitting here, you have some money. But now you need a really coordinated, centralized efforts.
Hotels will be experiencing, crippling losses doing that. And we know that the hotel business in itself makes up 5% of the GDP.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on.
We shouldn't underestimate the power of entrepreneurship. We need to escalate that, whether it's through the government's helping with tax breaks or subsidies of that nature to increase manufacturing of those types of products. It can happen quickly. A Marshall-type plan, don't mean to say that exactly, but a Marshall plan that can go into effect can stimulate change very quickly.
Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged? And what if that false information is coming from companies or from governments?
I think it's very important that we make sure that there is concise communication with all healthcare facilities where these patients are being treated so that there isn't mass panic.
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news.
I personally do not believe that trying to shut things down in terms of information is either practical or desirable. And we do have, I think, a couple of strategies that are available to us, one of which is the flood strategy, second of which is relying and informing and equipping trusted sources of information with the facts so they can then pass that on. But we also need to actually think about a technological answer to this.
The outcome of the CAPS pandemic in Event 201 was catastrophic. 65 million people died in the first 18 months. The outbreak was small at first and initially seemed controllable, but then it started spreading in densely crowded and impoverished neighborhoods of megacities. From that point on, the spread of the disease was explosive. Within 6 months, cases were occurring in nearly every country. The global economy was in a free fall. The GDP down 11%. Stock markets around the world plummeted between 20 and 40% and headed into a downward cycle of fear and low expectation. Businesses were not borrowing, banks were not lending. Everyone was just hoping to hunker down and weather the storm. Economists say the economic turmoil caused by such a pandemic will last for years, perhaps a decade. The societal impacts, the loss of faith in government, the distrust of news, and the breakdown of social cohesion could last even longer. We have to ask, did this need to be so bad? Are there things we could have done in the 5 to 10 years leading up to the pandemic that would have lessened the catastrophic consequences? We believe the answer is yes. So, are we, as a global community, now finally ready to do the hard work needed to prepare for the next pandemic?
And as much as it doesn't replicate corona pandemic and COVID-19 as we know it had many of the features that we're currently seeing now. And that's the whole point of futures thinking, is to be able to anticipate the possibilities that might emerge. If we analyze that little exercise, so a couple of things. Firstly, we're watching it now when some of you might have seen it already, and also we're watching it now in terms of where in many countries the peak is over, and I know we're seeing second waves. But if we watch this at the early start in around, well, certainly in South Africa, if we watched it in March, it would have been pretty scary because we wouldn't have seen how things panned out, and that was a potential that could have happened. And then how do we respond? Some really key elements in there, you see they spoke about fake news, about global supply chains, about economic disruption. All of those things, they don't mirror reality exactly, but they have very strong symbolic one-to-one mapping in many of the aspects that we're currently facing right now. So, by the way, that was one of the reasons that Bill Gates has been accused of kind of conspiracy theory around COVID-19, because Johns Hopkins University and I think Bill Gates Foundation might have funded it a little bit. And so there was a bit of accusation around Gates and others because of vaccines and, you know, that kind of thing. But this was a policy exercise. It's essentially a form of futures thinking that's converted into an immersive learning environment so that we can start to experience the possibilities. So it's a combination of, let's say, aspects of scenario planning, an aspect of dialogue in the form of a policy exercise. Every one of these people are real people. They're not actors. They were bringing things to bear. They were engaging on these issues from their perspective. And you'll see, for example, some people are fairly work from their boundaries, like the Marriott Hotel. It was all about hotels, and the CDC in China having centralized perspectives, and the Gates Foundation about private enterprise. And, you know, so the point is when you bring all these multiple perspectives to bear, we get a richer understanding of how things may or may not work. All right, so that was just kind of giving you one example of a policy exercise, which is one of the methods in the Foresight palette. Okay, so Foresight is a learning process that offers decision makers new perspectives, hopefully refreshing perspectives on the situation, which is puzzling, socially messy, and about how to work with uncertainty and taking uncertainty as a friend rather than a foe, and it's developing that capacity. So here's 3 different perspectives on how you work with futures. The one is there's multiple futures and outlooks. If we look at the present and we look at the trends, then we apply forecasting and we try to predict the most likely future. This works relatively well for the short-term futures because, for example, things like weather forecasting, even though they're never accurate, the kind of overall parameters are within a boundary. So existing forecasting techniques can work for relatively short-term where there aren't too many variables interacting with each other beyond, so for example, social, economic, ecological, all being intertwined. So that's one way of thinking about the future, is applying forecasting using trends. The other one is scenarios. You look at the present and you explore alternative futures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different plausible futures, and there's different ways of doing it. And then you have what is known as backcasting. Backcasting is you collectively decide on a common future we want to bring forth as humanity, in the hope that we can try and figure out what's feasible and getting there, and then we do a process of what's known as backcasting of the steps we need to take to get there. Obviously, we'll never get it exactly, but it's a way of using values and norms and idealized perspectives to possibly conceive of futures that we want to bring forth. And the future is always a mix of design and emergence, meaning design is the things we put in place now that will open up possibilities that take us to a future, and emergence are the things that will hit us that we hadn't even conceived of. And a future emerges through a combination of design and emergence. So let's do this now. Can I ask you, just take 5 or 10 minutes to yourself there and create an ideal picture of what you would like the world to be. Not what you think it might be, not what you're afraid of, but a world that you want to live in, or well, your children and your grandchildren to live in, for the older folk. And for the younger folk, a world that you want to live in. Think about some of the problems plaguing us today and create a world that is better and more sustainable. And kind of just list down what the main features are, draw a picture, give yourself, say, 3 minutes to do that, reflect on it, and then just type in the text box describing what you drew, what the features were. And look around you. What do you see? What technologically, what do you see? And don't focus only on technology. Focus on the social aspects. What does the world look like? How do people relate to each other? Products and services are, yes, important, but how do How do we relate to the world? How do we relate to others? How do we relate to ourselves? What do we think about the environment? Kind of picture all of those things. How will transport happen? How will business happen? Will businesses still exist? How will your children be educated? Where would play happen? Where would leisure happen? So be as expansive as possible and think of a world of what you would like to see in 2040. Please draw a picture. Unfortunately, we might be able to upload it. I don't know, but at least describe what that picture might look like. All right, you keep typing and I'm just going to move on. Thank you for that. Okay, so what you do here, exactly what you've just done, is you identify and idealize. This is backcasting. You identify an idealized future, collectively, ideally. So now we're just doing it quickly as individuals, but in a participatory way, we get together and we start conceiving of an idealized future. And obviously, we give it some test for some relevance of plausibility. And then backcasting basically does this. Conceptually, all it does is move step by step backwards. So we hear, what do we need to have in place for that idealized future to happen? So what kind of technology, what kind of infrastructure, what kind of rules and institutional mechanisms do we need to in place to have that? And in order for us to have that, what do we need to have to get that? And we keep doing this backcasting, stepping back until we get to the present. And that's a way of starting to get, so in the futures world, these are known as normative futures, where we are trying to identify what a norm for a future might be. And that's the technique of backcasting. Here's just another version of it. What do I do today to achieve this future perspective? I don't like to use the word vision, so I'm going to use the word idealized future. And you move, so you figure out what needs to be done, and then incrementally we put the mechanisms in place to help us get there. And obviously what's going to happen is there are things we can't conceive of now. So we're making these steps, and as we go, we might actually land there, not necessarily what we thought. We land there, and we land there, and so on, and hopefully we get to, and as we go, our normalized future might also change, because now there's new learning that we have, so it won't be exactly what we said. We've done backcasting, but we kind of get to a normalized, idealized future that we would like. Okay, one of the things that you can use as a tool is what's called a futures triangle. There are certain things that take us, that kind of project us, move us towards plausible futures, and it's these three perspectives. What are the pushes of the present? So in other words, what's the things that's in our infrastructure, in our social technologies, in our lives right now, that's pushing us as if it's not going to change and it's going to hold us back, so it's pushing us from the present into the future. Then it's the weight of history, of the past. There are certain things, a residue that we've carried, and you see it in South Africa. We have the weight of history still, like, what's the word? I can't, albatross on our shoulder in terms of where we are right now as a society, with all our problems in terms of social cohesion, differences, dealing with difference. We still have a long way to go, because the weight of history is still pulling us down in terms of the future that we want. And then pulls from the future, meaning the kinds of things you've just done in terms of your idealized future. So when you have a strong value system of a world that you want to have and you want to live in and you want to create and you want to sacrifice to get to that world, that's the pulls from the future. So we working with the pulls from the future, the pushes of the present, and the weight of history, which will ultimately pull us somewhere in this triangle. And we might land up being here or there, don't know where that might be. But this is a way of helping us think practically about what is driving the emergent futures. Another little tool is called the emerging issues analysis. And essentially what you do is, think about it this way, is, all right, from an analysis point of view, we do an analysis now, we do an environmental scan, and we pick up all the issues that are currently facing us or that we perceive. And then we map them on this emerging issues analysis. Which of these are manifested problems already, right now? So right now, as we speak, we're having corruption. As a result of lockdown, there's economic issues, people are without jobs, etc., etc., etc. What are some of the trends that seem to be emerging? And some of these like emerging issues we're starting to see now. So for example, where would you plot issues around climate change? I would imagine it's sitting somewhere here. It's no longer just the emerging issues. We're probably sitting somewhere here. So the emerging issues are stuff that we don't fully understand yet, we haven't fully grasped yet. That's essentially in time will become manifested problems. So these are the things that are around the future. These are the things that are around now. So that's another little tool that you could apply, emerging issues analysis. Okay, an important aspect, especially in scenario work, we start with this. It's a well-known kind of conceptual model, so I won't go too much into it, but it's essentially our relationship, us either as individuals or families or communities or schools or countries or businesses, and our immediate environment around us, and then the broader contextual environment. The important thing about this picture is we start to think about what we call the driving forces in the contextual environment, which gets mediated by this transactional environment that impacts us in the future. And scenarios work plays a lot of emphasis on the scenario planning. Then there's this tool called the cone of plausibility, which basically says that if you have an official future, so that's the past, that's the present. If you have an official future, this is what you think is going to happen. We all have this implicit and we need to interrogate that. That's a single line future, and we know that ain't going to happen. Then we say, what's the limits of plausibility? So we can conceive by applying these methods of plausible futures, and some things are completely out of the limit of plausibility at this point in time. And we might find as we proceed, we'd have to change that. But for now, you want to stay within the limits of plausibility. So you have this cone of plausibility that says you have these multiple alternate futures. And then this is that normative future that you might have thought about, the idealized perspective. And you analyze and you do your work to help you figure this out. The whole point of this is understanding the set of uncertainties that will impact the future that ultimately emerges. Scenarios, I won't go into too much of detail because it's well known, but scenario planning is basically taking a version of this and mapping out a small set of alternate futures. This is an interesting little perspective. Normally when you do scenario planning, you try to have balanced scenarios, unless you're doing normative scenarios, meaning there's good and bad features in each scenario and there's a mixture. This little picture says we can work incrementally. We can say no change scenario, meaning your official future of the decision makers or the people who are exploring. If we have a few changes, what would it look like? If we have a few more adaptive changes, then finally a radical change scenario. So this is another way of thinking of scenario planning. Here's a little quote, and I like this part about the end of the sentence. So to ask the question, is this a luxury for that the developing world cannot afford? And this is the Asian Development Bank. It does a lot of futures work in Asia. And so she says the powerful thing about foresight, especially if you use causal layered analysis, that's a particular tool, which we won't go into detail. I might just show it to you, is that you touch people's emotions and feelings, because ultimately that's where you want to be. You need to have a visceral feeling of what the future might look like, not a sterile map of the future, because it's our humanity which actually propels the future in combination with all the things around us. Here's a little 4 worlds of work in future. Again, I'm just going to leave it up for 10 seconds. You start to see how scenario work kind of uses, the simplest version of scenario work uses 2 dimensions to map out alternative futures. And this is the future of work and the different possibilities.
We can sense that the world is changing every day. As the leading logistics company worldwide, Deutsche Post DHL is a driver of change. At the same time, numerous factors impact our business, including technology, the environment, and changing social circumstances. Together with renowned experts, we pondered what the future may hold. This is how Logistics 2050 emerged. Join us on our journey into the year 2050. What will influence everyday reality then? To be prepared for the future and make the right decisions, we have to think in alternatives. Let's stretch our imaginations and look ahead. (2050), simply breathtaking. Over 9 billion people. Global mass consumption. Climate change is accelerating. The rapid growth of world trade sets the pace for business and the economy. Vast transport networks supply the world with more and more goods. The planet is running hot. Even the systematic exploitation of natural resources cannot satisfy the appetite for growth. Competition for natural resources puts our ecosystems at risk. Are there alternatives? (2050), a long green period for sustainable thinking and actions. Mega metropolises are centers of progress and pillars of global cooperation. But global urbanization has its downsides. Rural areas are left behind. Thanks to innovative and more efficient technologies, transport is more sustainable and much faster, for humans and for goods. The world has reinvented itself. We enjoy unlimited interaction and global cooperation. But could things turn out differently? In 2050, our world is much more colorful, diverse, and local. Technical progress, especially in 3D printing, turns consumers into producers. Self-made and individually tailored become the new ethos for society. New types of production processes facilitate a world with a multitude of individual lifestyles. Uniform goods and mass-produced items have vanished from display windows and apartments. The consequence of this development is not only a revolution in supply chains. Awareness about the need for recycling is growing, creating new commercial perspectives. It's a world characterized by diversity. But are more possibilities out there? In 2050, gloomy prospects. Nationalism dominates, and globalization is a thing of the past. Everywhere, borders are reimposed. Trade is restricted to regional blocks. Mutual mistrust leads to high customs barriers. Stagnation is the norm. International exchange has come to a standstill. Conflicts over natural resources are a daily occurrence. Will the future take us back to the past? Or are there different worlds? 2050, extreme weather conditions on supply routes force a rethink. Society retreats from risk-taking. Humanity accepts its vulnerability. Logistics makes rapid reaction and safe solutions possible. Even in emergencies, an immediate reaction is guaranteed since securing the supply chain is a top priority. Flexible, high-tech solutions are applied to ensure rapid response to unforeseen events. The world has become resilient. Different scenarios, diverging perspectives. Let us weigh our options and shape the future with today's decisions.
We're doing futures thinking to be able to envision plausible futures or idealized futures, depending which way we want to go, to try and understand that in its full perspective, and then take it from there. We then, once we've done that, we now have a sense of multiple plausible futures. We then have to say, how do we respond as society, as families, as governments, as businesses, as human beings, whatever it might be. And this is where we now need to be crafting solutions, innovative solutions. And here's where design thinking can come into play, because the fundamental for me in design thinking is that design thinking is, one, being adaptive to users. So in this case, we're thinking about what a future user might be. And those future users probably ourselves too. Okay, so that's the one key element for me in design that makes design thinking stand out. It's putting ourselves in the view, in the shoes, in the empathetic perspective and the worldview of the user, and in this case, likely a future user. That's the one thing. And the second thing is the idea of quick, fast turnaround times, rapid prototyping. And those combination of those two things is, for me, what stands out in design thinking. So design thinking will come up in relation to the solutions that we want to design to be able to be robust in those futures, to be resilient, to etc. And when I say I'm not thinking only in terms of products and services. So obviously products and services is a big part if you're a business and so on. But I think what we don't pay enough attention to when we think about futures thinking is, what are the rules of engagement that we need to change? What are the new kinds of instruments we have to design? What are the social, I don't even like to use the word technology, but let me rather use the word social infrastructure. What kinds of new social infrastructure do we need to be able to respond to those futures? So for example, democratization. Right now, much of the world is facing the issues we have is because we don't have democracies. We call them democracies, but we don't have democracies. So how do we build social infrastructures for better democratization, for example? Okay, let me just see. I hope that kind of answered a little bit. Let me go to the next one. Triplet of opacity, Nassim, the black swan. Illusion of understanding, retrospective distortion, overvaluation. Okay. All right, so yeah, the issues from the black swan, Rudy, I don't know I kind of get it. I don't know the terminology as well as the way you've presented it, but it kind of fits in more or less what we're saying. The one thing though is Taleb's work kind of focuses this thing about, I think he critiques inductive knowing a bit too much in my own view. There's a place for it because of the dangers of it. But we can't live our worlds in deductive thinking all the time. You cannot operate because there's not just insufficient data available for us to be living in a deductive frame. The world happens through a combination of both. But yeah, thank you for that. Agree with your thoughts on democracy. Wonderful. Keep typing. I just want to get our next little thing ready before we close. My last kind of interactive input from you before we close, if I can find it. So I just need a second. But please keep typing, keep chatting. Right, so what I'd like you to do now, please, is I'm gonna give you another code and I'm sending you back. So again, please open up a new menti.com or refresh. So it's not the old one. You're gonna type in a new code and the code is 4058857. And you're going to be doing two things. There's two slides. The first one is, so before you go there, think about this. What are the 5 things that I am prepared to give up so we have a better world? So you thought about an idealized future, but what are the 5 things I am prepared to give up so we have a better world? Jot that down. If three things is also fine. And you're going to type that in the menti.com. And then I'm just going to ask you to kind of give an overall perspective on the session. People found it thought-provoking and you started to learn to think about the future differently. Shook the comfort zones a little bit more than a little bit. And so, yeah, so I'm pleased to see that you're finding that this whole perspective of futures thinking and foresight is important for you. That's wonderful. Thank you for the engagement. Thank you for the time and for staying the course. We hope that it's piqued your interest a little bit and you want to come and learn more practically on how to apply it in your kind of areas. So yeah, thank you. It's been an honor. The next time around will be much more engagement because we can see each other and we'll be doing small group work. Yeah, so it's less one way, it's more multi-way, and I think that's important for this kind of work. So thank you very much. Those who need to leave, thank you. Good to see you. And if you want to stick around and ask a few questions, you're more than welcome to do so.